Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we travel back to a time when the world held its breath not in anticipation, but in fear of something invisible, yet omnipresent. The year is 1918, and while the Great War draws to its weary close in the trenches of Europe, another enemy has begun its silent march across the globe. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. Imagine yourself settling into the rhythm of a time when each morning brought uncertainty, when the simple act of breathing became conscious and careful. This is the story of the Spanish flu pandemic, though it likely began nowhere near. Benign, microscopic invader that would reshape daily life in ways both profound and intimate. Tonight, you will walk the empty streets of American cities, feel the weight of God's masks against your face, and understand what it meant to live when death moved unseen through communities. You will witness how this invisible threat touched even the most powerful, changed the very fabric of social interaction, and left traces in forgotten hospital records that tell stories of both despair and quiet heroism. As you listen, allow yourself to drift into this world of cautious whispers and muffled conversations, where the rhythm of normal life slowed to accommodate a new reality. Let the gentle cadence of these historical moments carry you toward rest, as we explore together what it truly meant to live during those uncertain months when humanity learned to fear the very air it breathed. The story begins with a simple storefront, a bell above a door, and the morning light filtering through windows that looked out onto streets growing ever more silent. You rise before dawn, as you have for the past 15 years, but this morning carries a weight that settles differently in your chest. The familiar creak of floorboards beneath your feet echoes through the small apartment above your general store, and you pause at the window to look down at Main Street, where once you would have seen the milk wagon making its rounds and early workers hurrying toward the factory. Now there is only the pale morning light casting long shadows across empty cobblestones. The gauze mask hangs on its hook by the door, a strange new addition to your daily routine. You lift it carefully, feeling the soft cotton against your fingertips. The local health board issued stern warnings. Just last week, no person shall appear in public without proper face covering. The words seemed so official, so distant, until Mrs. Henderson from 3 doors down succumbed to the fever. Then young Timothy Morrison. Then the entire Kowalski family, one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. You tie the mask behind your ears, adjusting it until it sits properly across your nose and mouth. The fabric smells faintly of the carbolic acid solution you've been soaking it in each night, following the health department's instructions printed in the newspaper. Everything smells of carbolic acid. No hands, your clothes, the very air in your store has become the scent of survival, sharp and medicinal, cutting through the usual aromas of coffee beans, and fresh bread that once defined your little corner of the world. The wooden stairs creak under your weight as you descend to the shop floor. Here, in the familiar sanctuary of your store, shelves that were once fully stocked now show gaps like missing teeth. Supply deliveries have become irregular, sometimes stopping entirely for weeks at a time. The Morrison Wholesale Company stopped answering telegrams after Timothy died, and you learned from his widow that half their warehouse workers had taken ill. The great machinery of commerce, which had seemed so reliable and permanent, now stutters and stalls with each new wave of sickness. You unlock the heavy front door and turn the sign from closed to open, though you wonder if anyone will venture out today. Yesterday brought only 3 customers: Mrs. Petrosky buying milk for her sick husband, young Sam Fletcher picking up medicine for his grandmother, and a stranger passing through town who needed directions to the nearest doctor. Each interaction was conducted through the filter of gauze, masks, and careful distance. Conversations muffled and strangely formal. The bell above your door, a polished brass that once announced the cheerful arrival of neighbors and friends, now serves as an early warning system. You find yourself listening for its ring with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Each customer represents both income and risk, commerce and contamination existing in an uncomfortable balance that would have been unimaginable just months ago. You begin your morning routine, dusting shelves that barely need it, arranging and rearranging merchandise that will likely sit untouched for days. The familiar tasks provide comfort, a sense of normalcy in a world that has shifted beneath your feet. You count the remaining bottles of patent medicine, Dr. Morrison's lung tonic, Fletcher's cough syrup, various tonics and elixirs that promise relief but offer little hope against this particular illness. People buy them anyway, grasping for any thread of control in a situation that defies human mastery. The morning newspaper lies folded on your counter, delivered by young Peter Walsh, who now rides his bicycle down the center of empty streets instead of weaving between carriages and pedestrians. The headlines speak of rising death tolls in distant cities: Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, places that once seemed impossibly far away, but now feel connected by invisible threads of contagion. You read these reports with the same careful attention you once reserved for crop prices and weather forecasts, understanding that these distant tragedies are harbingers of what may yet come to your own quiet community. Through your front window, you watch the town slowly stir to life. Mr. Jameson opens his barbershop across the street, propping his door open to let fresh air circulate as the health authorities have recommended. His usual morning ritual of sweeping the sidewalk has become more elaborate. He now sprinkles the pavement with bleach solution, creating small white patches that will dry to powdery reminders of invisible dangers. The familiar sounds of awakening town, horses' hooves on cobblestones, the distant whistle of the morning train, voices calling greetings across the street all seem muted now, as if the very air has grown thick and reluctant to carry sound. You remember when the first cases appeared in your town, how quickly the comfortable rhythms of daily life began to unravel. The church stopped holding services. The school closed its doors, sending children home to uncertain fates. The weekly town council meetings moved outdoors, then eventually stopped altogether as council members began falling ill or simply stopped appearing. Social gatherings that had knitted your community together for generations, barn dances, church suppers, card games at the firehouse vanished almost overnight, leaving behind a strange quietude that settles over everything like morning fog. The mail carrier approaches your door, and you watch him through the window as he sorts through letters with gloved hands. Even this simple daily interaction has become complicated by new rituals of safety. He will leave your mail on the counter rather than handing it to you directly. You will wait until he has left before handling the envelopes, and you will set them aside for several hours before opening them, following advice you read in a medical journal about how long the illness might survive on paper surfaces. Your first customer of the day pushes through the door just as the courthouse clock strikes 8. It's Martha Sullivan, the school teacher, her face pale above her carefully tied mask. She moves with the deliberate slowness of someone who has learned to conserve energy, and you recognize the signs he's been caring for someone who is ill. Her usually neat hair shows the dishevelment of sleepless nights, and her dress, while clean, bears the wrinkles of someone who has slept in a chair beside a sick bed. "Good morning, Martha," you call softly, your voice muffled by the gauze. She nods in response, and you can see her eyes attempting to smile above the fabric that hides her expression. Communication has become a matter of eyes and posture, of reading meaning in the set of shoulders and the tilt of a head. Humanity has learned to speak a new language of half-hidden faces and careful distances. She requests the usual item: soap, clean rags for nursing, and whatever fever-reducing powders you might have in stock. You gather these items while maintaining the proper 6-foot distance that has become as natural as breathing, though it feels anything but natural. The simple act of conducting business now requires a choreography of careful movements, a dance of commerce performed by partners who dare not touch as you wrap her purchases in brown paper. She mentions that her sister's family in the next county over has taken Elah, 5 of them, confined to their beds with the fever, a struggling breath that has become the signature of this plague. Her voice carries the particular exhaustion of someone who has been waiting for bad news and has finally received it. You offer what comfort you can through layers of fabric and physical distance, knowing that your words, however kind, cannot bridge the isolation that has become each person's daily companion. After she leaves, return to your quiet vigil behind the counter. The store feels larger somehow, as if the absence of normal human activity has caused the walls to expand. You find yourself studying the familiar objects around you, the penny candy jars, the bolts of fabric, the tools and household goods, as if seeing them for the first time. They remain constant while the world changes around them, silent witnesses to a way of life that has been temporarily suspended but may never fully return. The afternoon brings a different quality of light through your windows. It's golden and warm, but even the sunshine seems subdued. You think about the children who should be walking home from school at this hour, their voices carrying across the square as they plan afternoon adventures. Instead, the silence stretches unbroken except for the occasional sound of a horse's hooves or the distant whistle of a train that may or may not stop at your station, depending on whether the crew remains healthy enough to maintain their route. You close your store as the sun begins to set, following the same ritual in reverse, turning the sign, locking the door, climbing the stairs to your small apartment. But before you extinguish the oil lamp in your window, you pause to look out at the street one more time. Here and there, other windows glow with warm light, evidence that life continues behind closed doors. In some of those rooms, families gather for supper, grateful for another day of health. In others, people tend to the sick with the quiet dedication that has become this pandemic's most enduring heuristic. You prepare for sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring another day of this strange, careful existence. The rhythms of your life have slowed to accommodate new realities, but they continue nonetheless. In your dreams, you sometimes remember what it felt like to see a customer's full smile, to shake hands without fear, to breathe deeply without thinking about the air around you. But when you wake, you will tie on your gauze mask once again and open your store to whatever the day might bring. Part of a vast network of ordinary people learning to live with extraordinary circumstances. The weeks blend together in a haze of repeated precautions and careful rituals. You have learned to read the town's health through subtle signs, the number of chimneys producing smoke in the morning, indicating homes where people are well enough to tend fires. The presence or absence of curtains drawn back from windows, showing whether families feel safe enough to let in the light. The sound of children's laughter, increasingly rare, that makes you pause in whatever task occupies your hands to listen until it fades. Your morning walk to check the mail has become a meditation on solitude. The post office, once a bustling center of community gossip and news, now operates through a small window with Mrs. Greenbaum, the postmaster's wife, sorting mail while wearing a mask she sewed herself from floral cotton. She slides letters across the counter with a stick rather than handing them directly. And you've grown accustomed to this strange choreography of distance. The letters themselves tell stories of a world struggling to maintain connections across vast spaces of isolation, families separated by quarantine, businesses trying to survive with skeleton crews, lovers writing with uncertain hope about when they might meet again. Each day brings its own small adaptations to this new reality. You've learned to keep a bowl of vinegar water by the door for washing your hands after touching anything a customer has handled. The sharp scent has become as familiar as coffee or bread, a constant reminder of invisible dangers to come. You've rearranged your store to encourage distance-spreading merchandise across more space, placing chairs where customers might wait rather than crowd around the counter. These changes, initially awkward and unnatural, now feel like permanent alterations to the landscape of daily commerce. The local doctor, Dr. Henley, stops by your store more frequently now, not as a customer, but as a weary messenger, carrying news between households. His face, visible above his professional-grade mask, shows the accumulating strain of these months. He moves more slowly than before, and his conversations have taken on a measured quality, as if he weighs each word before speaking. He tells you about families in the outlying farms who haven't been to town in weeks, surviving on preserved food and well water, hoping that isolation will protect them from the plague that continues to move through populated areas. The rhythm of deliveries has changed dramatically. The weekly supply wagon now arrives irregularly, sometimes bringing news that the driver's route has been shortened due to quarantines in neighboring towns. You've learned to be grateful for whatever arrives, and to ration supplies in ways that would have seemed unnecessary in the abundance of previous years. The simple act of receiving goods has become complicated by new protocols, leaving boxes outside to air for hours before bringing them inside, washing every surface with disinfectant solutions, checking each item for signs that it might carry contamination. Your afternoon routine now includes a walk through the residential streets, not out of curiosity, but from a sense of community responsibility that has evolved during these difficult months. You check on houses where you know elderly people live alone, looking for signs of activity, smoke from chimneys, movement behind windows, or the small signals neighbors have developed to indicate they are well. Sometimes you leave basic supplies on doorsteps with notes explaining their purpose, understanding that these small gestures of care must now be performed at a distance. The evening brings a particular quality of silence that would have been unimaginable before the pandemic. Streets that once carried the sounds of social visiting people calling to neighbors, children playing games that spilled from yard to yard, the easy laughter of casual conversations now settle into quiet by early sunset. Occasionally, you hear the sound of someone coughing, and it carries across the still air with an ominous weight that makes you close your windows and check once again that your own health remains intact. You've developed a new relationship with the newspaper, reading it not just for information, but as a connection to a larger world that continues to exist beyond your immediate experience. The reports from distant cities paint pictures of overwhelmed hospitals and mass graves, realities so severe they seem to belong to a different world entirely. Yet these same papers carry advertisements for normal life clothing sales, entertainment options, business opportunities, creating a strange dissonance between the catastrophic and the mundane that has become characteristic of this period. The local church has adapted to restrictions by holding services outdoors when weather permits, with families maintaining careful distances while attempting to preserve some sense of shared worship. You attend these gatherings occasionally, standing apart from neighbors you've known for years, singing hymns through masks that muffle voices and create an otherworldly quality to familiar melodies. The pastor's sermons have evolved to address questions that previous generations never faced: how to maintain faith during isolation, how to care for others while protecting yourself, how to find meaning in loss that seems random and inexplicable. Your store has become an informal information center, a place where people stop not just for goods, but for news about who has recovered, who has fallen ill, and how families are managing in isolation. These conversations happen across careful distances, voices raised slightly to carry across the space that safety requires. You've become skilled at reading faces above masks, interpreting the subtle communications of eyes and posture that have become the primary means of emotional expression in public spaces. The changing seasons add their own complexity to this altered way of life. As autumn approaches, the usual preparations for winter take on new urgency. Families are preserving more food than usual, stockpiling supplies against the possibility of extended quarantine. The harvest, traditionally a community effort involving shared labor and celebration, now happens in smaller groups or individual family units. The familiar rhythms of seasonal change continue, but they are overlaid with calculations about survival that give every decision additional weight. Your relationship with time itself has changed. Days are measured not by the usual markers of business and social activity, but by smaller, more personal rhythms. The number of customers who venture out is a pattern of smoke from neighboring chimneys. The sound of Dr. Henley's automobile making its rounds to check on patients. Hours pass more slowly when filled with vigilance rather than routine activity. And you find yourself noticing details that would have escaped attention in busier times. The way light falls across empty streets. The particular silence that follows after church bells stop ringing. The gradual changes in the behavior of even the town's animals, who seem to sense the alteration in human patterns. Some adaptations surprise you with their permanence. You've learned to appreciate solitude in ways that would have been impossible before forced isolation taught you its rhythms. The quiet hours in your store, once filled with constant customer interaction, now provide time for reflection and observation. That has revealed aspects of your community and yourself that remained hidden during busier times. You've discovered a capacity for patience that serves well in situations where waiting and watching become more important than action and engagement. The economic impacts ripple through every transaction. Money changes hands less frequently, and when it does, the exchange carries additional meaning, not just the value of goods, but the calculated risk of interaction. Careful balance between necessity and safety. You've extended credit to families facing hardship, understanding that the traditional calculations of business risk must expand to include considerations of community survival. Some debts may never be repaid, but the alternative, allowing neighbors to suffer without assistance, seems unthinkable in circumstances where everyone's welfare has become interconnected in ways that were invisible before the pandemic revealed them. The first snow of the season arrives earlier than usual, dusting the empty streets with a pristine whiteness that seems to muffle even the reduced sounds of your altered town. You stand at your store window, watching the flakes drift past the street lamps in the early evening light, and realize that this winter will test your community in ways that previous winters never did. The simple challenges of staying warm and fed have become complicated by the ongoing need to maintain isolation, to balance survival against the risk of contagion that still moves unseen through the population. Your store has become a repository of stories, though they are shared in whispers and fragments rather than the full narratives that once accompanied leisurely shopping visits. Mrs. Patterson mentions that her sister in the state capitol hasn't written in 3 weeks, and you both understand what this silence might mean without speaking the possibility aloud. Young Samuel Morrison, now the man of his household since his father's death, stops by for supplies with the careful dignity of someone who has aged beyond his years in a matter of months. These brief encounters carry emotional weight that transforms routine transactions into moments of witness, making you a keeper of your community's unspoken fears and quiet courage. The transformation of social customs has created a strange new etiquette around illness and death. Previously, news of someone's passing would bring the community together in shared grief and mutual support. Now, such news often travels through whispered conversations across careful distances, and the traditional rituals of mourning have been reduced to small, private ceremonies that leave families to bear their losses in isolation. You've learned to recognize the signs of recent bereavement in your customers, the particular stillness in their movements, the way they speak only when necessary, the careful selection of basic necessities that suggests a household disrupted by loss. The mail brings increasingly desperate letters from suppliers in larger cities, describing warehouses where half the workers have fallen ill and shipments that sit untouched because there are too few healthy people to load the wagons. These business communications, once dry recitations of prices and availability, now read like dispatches from a war zone where the enemy is invisible and the casualties mount in ways that traditional commerce never anticipated. You've learned to plan for shortages that might last weeks or months, developing relationships with local farmers and craftspeople who can provide alternatives to goods that no longer arrive from distant suppliers. Winter preparations take on an urgency that your grandparents might have recognized but that your generation had almost forgotten. You work with other shopkeepers to coordinate supplies, ensuring that basic necessities remain available even if luxury items disappear from the shelves. The blacksmith has begun making simple medical instruments to replace items that can no longer be ordered from manufacturers. The local seamstresses have shifted their work to producing masks and other protective items. Their skills adapted to serve a need that didn't exist a year ago. Your evening walks through the residential areas have revealed how dramatically the rhythms of family life have changed. Houses that once glowed with the warm light of social gatherings now show single lamps in windows, evidence of families huddled together in small groups, conserving both fuel and warmth while maintaining the isolation that safety requires. Children's voices, when you hear them at all, come from behind closed doors rather than spilling out into yards and streets where play once created the soundtrack of neighborhood life. The local newspaper has evolved into something resembling a community bulletin board, carrying notices about who needs assistance, which families are offering help to neighbors, and how various businesses are adapting their operations to continue serving the community. The editor, Mr. Hartwell, has taken on the role of informal coordinator for mutual aid efforts, using his weekly publication to match people who have resources with those who need assistance. Reading these notices has become part of your weekly routine, a way of understanding how your neighbors are managing and where your own help might be most needed. Dr. Kenley's visits to your store have become informal conferences about the state of the community's health. He speaks in careful terms about recovery rates and the duration of illness, sharing what information he can without violating the privacy of his patients. These conversations have taught you to read between the lines of medical euphemism, to understand that a difficult case means someone is unlikely to survive, and that making progress might mean merely that death is not imminent. His presence in your store has become a barometer of local conditions when he appears relaxed and unhurried. You know the immediate crisis has eased when he moves with the urgent efficiency of someone managing multiple emergencies. He prepared for news of additional losses. The adaptation of religious practices has created new forms of community connection that work within the constraints of necessary distance. The local pastor has begun leaving weekly sermons written on paper at various businesses around town, allowing people to collect them and read them in the safety of their homes. Prayer circles have formed among neighbors who can see each other's houses, with participants standing in their own yards or at their windows to share in collective worship that maintains both spiritual connection and physical separation. These innovations in faith practice speak to the human need for shared meaning, even when shared presence becomes dangerous. Your role as shopkeeper has expanded far beyond commerce to include elements of social worker, information broker, and informal counselor. People linger in your store, not just to complete purchases, but to share concerns about relatives in distant places, to ask whether you've heard news about when schools might reopen, or simply to have a conversation with another adult after days of isolation with only family members for company. You've learned to provide these services through the filter of mask and distance, developing skills in reading emotional needs, that can only be partially expressed through visible portions of faces and the subtle language of posture and gesture. The changing relationship with food and cooking reflects broader adaptations to scarcity and isolation. Families who once relied on frequent shopping trips now purchase supplies in larger quantities, storing them carefully against the possibility that future trips might become impossible. Recipes have been adapted to use ingredients that can be preserved for long periods. Cooking techniques have been shared among neighbors through written notes rather than the hands-on teaching that once passed culinary knowledge through generations. Your store has become a repository for information about food preservation, with customers sharing successful techniques for making supplies last longer while maintaining nutritional value. The winter light is filtered through windows that remain closed against the cold, and the fear of contagion creates an atmosphere of suspended animation in your store. Dust motes drift through shafts of sunlight that seem less substantial than in previous years, as if even the light itself has been affected by the weight of collective anxiety. The familiar objects on your shelves, stools, fabric, household goods appear unchanged, but they exist now in a context so altered that their meaning has shifted. A simple bar of soap is no longer just a cleaning product, but a weapon against invisible enemies. A bottle of patent medicine represents hope in a situation where hope has become a precious commodity as the snow continues to fall, accumulating in drifts that will soon make travel between houses more difficult. You realize that your community is entering a new phase of this extended crisis. The isolation that began as a temporary precaution has become a way of life, and the adaptations that seemed extraordinary just months ago now feel like permanent changes to the fabric of daily existence. You prepare for a winter unlike any you have experienced, knowing that the usual patterns of community support and social connection will be tested in ways that will reveal both the fragility and the resilience of human bonds. The evening brings its familiar ritual of closing the store and climbing the stairs to your small apartment. But tonight, you pause at the window to look out at your town transformed by snow and silence. In scattered windows across the neighborhood, you can see the warm glow of oil lamps and candles, evidence that life continues behind closed doors. Each light represents a family finding ways to maintain hope and connection despite the barriers that circumstances have placed between them. Tomorrow will bring another day of careful commerce and cautious community, another opportunity to serve as a bridge between isolation and human contact in a world that has learned to fear the very closeness that makes us human. Far from the empty streets and shuttered shops of small-town America, in the corridors of power where nations' fates are decided, the same invisible enemy that stalks your neighborhood moves with equal indifference through the halls of the White House. The year is 1919, and President Woodrow Wilson stands at what should be the pinnacle of his career orchestrated to victory in the Great War, champion of a new world order built around his League of Nations. Yet, as he prepares for the most important diplomatic mission of his presidency, the microscopic adversary that has already claimed millions of lives worldwide prepares to strike at the very heart of American leadership. Imagine yourself in the mahogany-paneled rooms where history unfolds, watching as the president's daily routine continues with the meticulous precision that has always characterized his administration. Wilson rises each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, as he has for years, his habits as predictable as clockwork. His personal secretary, Joseph Tumulty, arrives with the morning briefings that will shape the day's decisions. But now, these documents carry an additional layer of concern: reports about the pandemic's impact on American cities, statistics that climb with relentless persistence, and urgent communications from health officials whose recommendations must be balanced against the pressing demands of international diplomacy. The White House itself has become a fortress of precaution. Its staff reduced to essential personnel who undergo daily health checks before entering the president's presence. The familiar routines of presidential life, the handshakes with visiting dignitaries, the crowded receptions for foreign ambassadors, the intimate dinner parties where policy is shaped through careful conversation, have been transformed into carefully orchestrated exercises in distance and protocol. Visitors now wait in different rooms before meetings, their health assessed by the White House physician before they are permitted to approach the president's private quarters. Dr. Carrie Grayson, Wilson's personal physician and trusted friend, moves through the White House with a heightened awareness of someone who understands that his patient's health carries implications far beyond personal concern. Every cough, every sign of fatigue, every slight deviation from the president's normal patterns becomes a matter of potential national significance. The doctor's black medical bag, once primarily symbolic of his presence in the presidential entourage, now contains the tools and medicines needed to combat an enemy that respects neither rank nor office. The president's preparation for his journey to the Paris Peace Conference proceeds with the intensity of a military campaign, but now the planning must include considerations that previous diplomatic missions never required. The ship that will carry Wilson and his delegation across the Atlantic has been equipped with isolation facilities and medical personnel trained in treating the pandemic illness. The president's quarters have been specially ventilated, and the entire route has been planned to minimize contact with populations where the disease continues to spread unchecked in the private moments between official duties. Wilson's wife, Edith, watches her husband with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read the subtle signs of declining health. The president's legendary energy is a force of will that has driven his political career from academic halls to the highest office in the land. Now requires more effort to maintain. His evening walks through the White House grounds, once invigorating breaks from the pressures of office, have become shorter and more labored. Though he continues them with the stubborn determination that has always characterized his approach to personal discipline. The international correspondence that flows through the White House tells a story of a world struggling to maintain diplomatic functions while battling an invisible enemy. Letters from European leaders describe conferences postponed due to illness among key negotiators, treaty discussions interrupted by quarantine requirements, and the complex challenge of conducting delicate international relations when the simple act of meeting in person has become fraught with mortal risk. These communications, written in the formal language of diplomatic protocol, could not fully convey the human costs of trying to rebuild a world, while that world continues to suffer from ongoing catastrophe. Wilson's famous morning routine of dictating correspondence to his stenographer has adapted to include the 6-foot distance that medical advisors now recommend for all interactions. The familiar rhythm of his voice, precise and measured as he crafts responses to world leaders and domestic concerns alike, now carries across a space that serves as both practical necessity and symbolic representation of how even the most intimate working relationships have been altered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The stenographer, trained to capture every nuance of presidential speech, now must also interpret communications filtered through cloth masks and physical separation. The president's private study, lined with books that represent a lifetime of scholarly pursuit, has become a sanctuary where he prepares for what may be the most challenging diplomatic mission in American history. The documents spread across his desk tell the story of a world in transition maps, showing the proposed boundaries of new nations, constitutional frameworks for international cooperation, and beneath it all, the ongoing reports of pandemic casualties that serve as a constant reminder of humanity's fragility. These papers, handled with the careful protocols now required for all materials that pass between individuals, represent both the highest hopes of human civilization and the stark reality of its vulnerability. The evening hours, once filled with social obligations and informal discussions with advisors and guests, now find Wilson increasingly isolated in the residential quarters of the White House. His conversations with Mrs. Wilson take on added significance, as she becomes not only his personal companion, but his primary source of unfiltered human contact. During a period when official interactions are constrained by medical necessity, their private dinners, served by staff who maintain careful distance and follow strict sanitation protocols, provide the only remaining space where the president can speak freely without the barriers that safety now requires in all other interactions. The physical toll of maintaining presidential responsibilities while implementing the precautions necessary for health becomes evident in small ways that would escape public notice, but cannot be hidden from those who work closely with the president. Wilson's famous attention to detail. His insistence on reviewing and personally editing important documents now requires longer sessions with more frequent breaks. The energy that once sustained 14-hour workdays now must be carefully managed and rationed. It's allocated to the most essential tasks, while less critical activities are delegated or postponed. Dr. Grayson's daily examinations of the president have evolved from routine health maintenance to careful monitoring for the early signs of the illness that has already claimed so many prominent figures across the country. The doctor's notes, kept in the strictest confidence, court not just medical observations, but the ongoing challenge of maintaining presidential health when the very activities that defined presidential leadership travel, public appearances, meetings with diverse groups of people have become potential sources of mortal danger. The White House staff, reduced in number but increased in responsibility, work within a framework of protocols that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Mail is handled with gloves and subjected to sanitization procedures before it reaches the president's desk. Visitors undergo health screenings that delay appointments and create new layers of security beyond the traditional concerns about physical threats. The familiar rhythms of White House life, the regular meetings, the scheduled receptions, the casual encounters that often produce the most important policy insights, have been replaced by a more formal and distant style of governance that serves necessity but sacrifices the human connections that often drive political effectiveness. The president's famous evening automobile rides through Washington, once opportunities for him to observe the city he governs and to be seen by the citizens he serves, now take him through streets that show the pandemic's impact in ways that statistics cannot convey. Empty sidewalks where crowds once gathered, businesses closed behind protective barriers, and the general atmosphere of caution that has settled over the capital city provide a daily reminder that even presidential power has limits when confronted with challenges that transcend political solutions. As Wilson prepares for his departure to Europe, the weight of responsibility sits differently on his shoulders than it has during previous international crises. The success of his mission will depend not only on his diplomatic skills and the strength of his arguments for international cooperation, but also on his ability to maintain his health and mental acuity while traveling through a world where the simple act of breathing has become a calculated risk. The irony is not lost on those closest to him that the president, who has spoken so eloquently about making the world safe for democracy, must now navigate a world that has become fundamentally unsafe for everyone, regardless of their position or power. The USS George Washington cuts through the Atlantic swells in December 1918, carrying President Wilson toward what he believes will be his greatest triumph, the negotiation of a peace that will end all wars and establish a new international order based on democratic principles and collective security. The ship's medical facilities have been expanded to accommodate the ongoing pandemic, and the president's quarters have been specially prepared with the latest ventilation systems and sanitation protocols. Yet, despite these precautions, the invisible enemy that has already claimed millions of lives continues its patient work, indifferent to the historic importance of its target. Imagine yourself in the president's private cabin as the days at sea pass with the steady rhythm of engines and waves. Wilson maintains his disciplined routine, even aboard ship, rising early to review the mountains of briefing materials that will guide his negotiations in Paris. His stenographer, Charles Swem, takes dictation while maintaining the careful distance. That has become standard practice, recording the president's thoughts on territorial adjustments, economic reparations, and the framework for international cooperation that will become the League of Nations. These morning sessions, conducted in the confined space of the ship's quarters, require the same health protocols that have transformed every aspect of presidential life. Dr. Grayson makes his rounds through the presidential party with heightened vigilance, knowing that the close quarters of shipboard life create ideal conditions for the spread of contagious illness. His medical bag now contains supplies that previous presidential voyages never required: thermometers for frequent temperature checks, medicines for respiratory ailments, the specialized equipment needed to treat the pandemic illness should it appear among the delegation. The doctor's observations, recorded in his private notes, document not only the president's physical condition, but the psychological strain of carrying such enormous responsibility while navigating the constant threat of illness. The other members of the American delegation move through the ship's common areas with the careful awareness of people who understand that their individual health has implications far beyond personal concern. Colonel Edward House, Wilson's closest advisor, maintains his own rigorous health routines while managing the complex preparations for the negotiations ahead. Secretary of State Robert Lansing reviews legal documents and treaty precedents while implementing the bad sanitization procedures that have become necessary for handling any materials that pass between individuals. These men, accustomed to the informal interactions that typically characterize high-level diplomatic preparation, now work within constraints that add formality and distance to relationships that have previously thrived on personal connection. The ship's crew, trained in the new protocols required for protecting high-profile passengers during a pandemic, maintains the vessel's operations while following procedures that would have seemed extraordinary just months earlier. Meals are served with extended service protocols that minimize contact between staff and passengers. Common areas are regularly sanitized with solutions that leave the pervasive smell of carbolic acid throughout the ship's corridors. The familiar rhythms of shipboard life continue, but they are overlaid with the careful choreography of disease prevention that has become the new normal for any gathering of people in enclosed spaces. As the George Washington approaches the European coast, reports reach the presidential party about the pandemic's continued devastation in the cities where the peace conference will convene. Paris, the designated site for the negotiations, has implemented its own series of health restrictions that will affect everything from the venues where meetings can be held to the protocols for interaction between the various national delegations. The romantic city that Wilson remembers from his earlier academic visits has been transformed into a place where beauty and culture exist alongside the constant awareness of invisible danger. The president's arrival in France marks the beginning of what will become one of history's most challenging diplomatic missions, complicated not only by the complex political and territorial issues left in the wake of the Great War, but also by the ongoing need to conduct delicate negotiations while maintaining the health precautions that the pandemic requires. Wilson's first meetings with European leaders take place in rooms that have been specially prepared with enhanced ventilation and spacing that allows for the physical distance. It's now considered essential for safety. The handshakes and intimate conversations that typically characterize diplomatic relations are replaced by more formal interactions that serve necessity but sacrifice some of the personal connection that often proves crucial in difficult negotiations. Accommodations prepared for the American delegation reflect the new realities of official travel during a pandemic. Wilson's residence in Paris has been equipped with the medical facilities and isolation capabilities that previous presidential visits never required. The staff assigned to serve the delegation has been selected not only for their professional qualifications, but also their health status and their training into sanitation protocols, now considered essential for protecting high-profile individuals. Every aspect of daily life, from meals to meetings to evening relaxation, now operates within a framework of precautions that add complexity to activities that were once straightforward. The negotiating sessions themselves present unprecedented challenges as representatives from dozens of nations attempt to conduct detailed discussions while maintaining the physical distance that medical advisors insist is necessary for safety. The grand conference rooms of Versailles, designed for ceremonial occasions that emphasize proximity and shared presence, now accommodate meetings where participants sit farther apart and communicate through the barriers of masks and careful protocol. The psychological impact of these constraints on the negotiation process becomes evident as discussions that might normally be resolved through informal sidebar conversations now require more formal procedures that slow progress and reduce the opportunities for the personal relationships that often facilitate diplomatic breakthroughs. Wilson's daily routine in Paris maintains the discipline that has always characterized his approach to important work, but now it must also accommodate the health monitoring and precautionary measures that Dr. Grayson considers essential. The president's morning walks through the Parisian streets, once opportunities for him to observe European life and gather impressions that inform his diplomatic approach, now require security arrangements that account not only for physical protection, but also for health considerations. The crowds that might once have gathered to see the American president are discouraged by authorities concerned about public gatherings during a pandemic, creating a strange atmosphere of celebration muted by caution. The progress of negotiations becomes intertwined with concerns about the health of key participants. Reports circulate regularly about various delegation members who have fallen ill, requiring adjustments to meeting schedules and creating uncertainty about whether crucial decisions can be made when key negotiators are unavailable. Wilson himself begins to show signs of the physical strain that comes from maintaining an intensive diplomatic schedule while dealing with the additional stress of constant health vigilance. His famous attention to detail and insistence on personally reviewing all important documents now requires longer sessions with more frequent breaks, and his legendary stamina shows signs of the wear that comes from operating under conditions of perpetual caution. The social aspects of diplomacy, traditionally conducted through receptions and dinner parties where informal relationships develop alongside formal negotiations, have been severely constrained by pandemic restrictions. The cultural exchanges that typically accompany major international conferences, visits to museums, attendance at theatrical performances, shared meals that build personal bonds between representatives of different nations either cannot occur or must be conducted within limits that reduce their effectiveness as diplomatic tools. Wilson, whose approach to international relations has always emphasized the importance of personal relationships and shared understanding, finds himself operating in an environment where such connections are difficult to establish and maintain. As winter deepens in Paris, the president's health begins to show more obvious signs of strain. The combination of intensive diplomatic work, constant vigilance about infection risk, and the psychological pressure of negotiating agreements that will affect millions of lives takes its toll in ways that would be evident to anyone observing his daily routine. His evening correspondence, once a source of energy and intellectual stimulation, now requires greater effort to complete. His conversations with Mrs. Wilson, who has accompanied him to Paris, reveal a weariness that goes beyond normal diplomatic fatigue to suggest the deeper exhaustion that comes from operating under conditions of sustained stress and uncertainty. Dr. Grayson's medical observations during this period document a gradual decline in the president's physical reserves, though Wilson continues to maintain his public schedule with a determination that has always characterized his approach to important responsibilities. The doctor's private notes record subtle changes, slightly elevated temperatures that might indicate the beginning of illness, increased fatigue that requires longer rest periods, and the kind of persistent minor symptoms that could be early signs of the disease that continues to claim victims throughout Europe. These medical concerns must be balanced against the diplomatic necessities that keep the president engaged in negotiations that cannot be postponed without potentially catastrophic consequences for international relations. The president's private moments in his Paris residence provide the only respite from the constant demands of public life conducted under pandemic constraints. His evening reading, once a pleasure that connected him to the intellectual pursuits that had defined his academic career, now focuses primarily on medical reports and health advisories that help him understand the risks he faces and the precautions necessary for continued safety. His correspondence with American officials back home increasingly includes discussions of domestic pandemic policy alongside international diplomatic concerns, reflecting the way that health considerations have become inseparable from every other aspect of governance. As February 1919 arrives, bringing with it the intensification of negotiations that will determine the final shape of the peace settlement, Wilson's physical condition becomes a matter of increasing concern to those closest to him. The president's legendary willpower continues to drive his participation in the complex discussions that will establish new national boundaries and international institutions, but the cost of maintaining this level of engagement while fighting off illness becomes more apparent to observers who know him well. The invisible enemy that has stalked him across the Atlantic and through the streets of Paris prepares to strike at the moment when his leadership is most crucial to the future of international relations. The morning of April 3rd, 1919, dawns gray and cold over Paris. But inside the president's residence on the Place des États-Unis, a different kind of chill settles over the American delegation. Dr. Grayson's early morning examination of President Wilson reveals what the physician has been dreading for months: the unmistakable signs that the pandemic illness has finally found its way past all their careful precautions. The president's temperature has risen to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. His breathing has become labored, and the familiar energy that has driven his diplomatic mission now flickers like a candle in an uncertain wind. Imagine yourself in the hushed corridors of power as word spreads quietly among the president's closest advisors that their leader has fallen victim to the same disease that has claimed millions of ordinary citizens around the world. The irony strikes with particular force Wilson, who has spent months crafting a new international order designed to prevent future catastrophes, now lies helpless before a catastrophe that recognizes no borders, respects no authority, and yields to no diplomatic negotiation. The fever that courses through his body carries with it implications that extend far beyond personal suffering to affect the fate of nations, the future of international cooperation. Mrs. Wilson takes up her post at her husband's bedside with the quiet determination of someone who understands that her vigil serves purposes both personal and political. The president's illness cannot be kept entirely secret, but neither can it be allowed to become public knowledge that might undermine American negotiating positions at the crucial moment when the peace treaty approaches its final form. She becomes the gatekeeper for information about her husband's condition, managing the delicate balance between necessary medical care and diplomatic discretion that will determine whether Wilson's vision for international cooperation survives. His personal crisis, Dr. Grayson works with the focused intensity of a physician who knows that his patient's recovery has implications far beyond the medical. The president's bedroom becomes a makeshift hospital ward, equipped with the latest treatments available for the pandemic illness. While medical science in 1919 offers limited options against a disease that is proven resistant to most therapeutic interventions, the doctor's notes from this period, written in the careful medical terminology that masks deep concern, document a case that follows the typical progression of severe pandemic illness: high fever, respiratory distress, and the kind of profound exhaustion that suggests the body's systems are under assault from an enemy they cannot effectively combat. The negotiations at Versailles continue in Wilson's absence, but his missing presence creates a vacuum that affects every aspect of the proceedings. Colonel House attempts to represent American interests, while knowing that crucial decisions are being made without the input of the man who conceived the overall framework for post-war international relations. The other Allied leaders, Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy, proceed with discussions that will shape the treaty's final terms, while wondering whether the American president will recover sufficiently to participate in the crucial final sessions that will determine the success or failure of the entire peace process. The president's private secretary, Joseph Tumulty, maintains the fiction of normal operations by continuing to issue statements and schedule appointments as if Wilson remained fully engaged in diplomatic activities. This necessary deception requires careful coordination among the American delegation members, who must present a united front while privately grappling with uncertainty about their leader's condition. The daily briefings that normally flow to the president are now filtered through Mrs. Wilson and Dr. Grayson, creating an unprecedented situation where the most important decisions in American foreign policy are being made by advisors operating without direct presidential guidance. Inside the sick room, Wilson drifts in and out of consciousness, his fever-clouded mind wrestling with fragments of the negotiations he has been forced to abandon. During his lucid moments, he attempts to continue working on the treaty details, dictating notes and instructions that often reflect the confusion and disorientation that accompany severe illness. Mrs. Wilson and Dr. Grayson make careful decisions about which of these fever-influenced communications should be acted upon and which should be quietly set aside until the president's mind clears sufficiently for coherent decision-making. The physical symptoms of Wilson's illness follow the pattern that has become grimly familiar to medical professionals dealing with pandemic cases. The high fever brings with it periods of delirium where the president speaks to people who are not present and relives conversations from earlier stages of his career. His breathing becomes increasingly difficult, requiring constant medical attention and the kind of supportive care that would be familiar to anyone who has watched a loved one struggle with serious respiratory illness. The robust physical presence that has always characterized Wilson's public appearances gives way to the frailty that the pandemic illness inflicts on its victims, regardless of their previous health or social status. Dr. Grayson's medical bulletins, carefully crafted to provide information without revealing the full extent of the president's condition, come exercises in diplomatic language that rivaled the most complex treaty negotiations. Each statement must convey enough truth to maintain credibility while avoiding the kind of detailed medical information that might trigger panic about American leadership or provide political ammunition for Wilson's domestic opponents. The doctor finds himself serving simultaneously as physician, diplomat, and guardian of state secrets in a situation that medical training never prepared him to handle. The international implications of Wilson's illness extend far beyond the immediate concerns about the peace negotiations. Allied leaders begin to make contingency plans for completing the treaty without meaningful American participation, while German representatives wonder whether Wilson's absence might create opportunities to negotiate more favorable terms. The carefully constructed balance of power that has guided the peace process now threatens to collapse under the weight of uncertainty about American leadership and commitment to the agreements being negotiated in Wilson's name. The president's fever reaches its peak during the second week of his illness, bringing with it the kind of medical crisis that threatens not only his life, but the entire structure of international cooperation that he has worked to establish. Dr. Grayson's private notes from this period reveal the physician's deep concern about his patient's survival. Though these medical observations remain strictly confidential, it's to prevent the political chaos that would result from public knowledge of the president's critical condition. The sick room becomes the center of a conspiracy of silence designed to protect both Wilson's privacy and American diplomatic interests. During the president's most critical hours, Mrs. Wilson effectively becomes the acting head of the American government, making decisions about which diplomatic communications require immediate attention and which can be delayed until her husband's condition improves. It's an unprecedented situation where the First Lady exercises executive authority without any constitutional basis for such power reflects the desperation of circumstances that find no precedent in American political history. Her decisions during this period will later become the subject of historical controversy, but at the moment, they represent the only available means of maintaining continuity in American governance while the elected president battles for his life. The gradual improvement in Wilson's condition begins almost imperceptibly, marked first by longer periods of consciousness and slowly decreasing fever. Dr. Grayson's cautious optimism appears in his medical notes as small improvements in respiratory function and brief moments when the president demonstrates awareness of his surroundings and circumstances. These early signs of recovery bring hope to the American delegation, but they also raise new questions about the extent to which Wilson's illness may have permanent effects on his mental acuity and physical stamina. As the president slowly regains strength, the true cost of his illness becomes apparent in ways that extend beyond personal suffering to affect the fundamental structure of the peace settlement. The negotiations have proceeded without his input during the most crucial phase, resulting in compromises and agreements that differ significantly from his original vision for post-war international relations. The League of Nations, his most cherished project, has been modified in ways that accommodate the concerns of other Allied leaders, while Wilson lay unable to defend his original conception of international cooperation. The president's first attempts to resume diplomatic activities revealed the extent to which the illness has affected his capacity for the intensive intellectual work that successful negotiation requires. His famous memory for detail shows gaps that require briefings on decisions made during his absence. His legendary stamina now requires careful management to prevent exhaustion that might trigger a relapse. The forceful personality that has always been Wilson's primary diplomatic weapon now operates at reduced capacity, creating challenges for the final phase of negotiations that will determine whether his vision for international peace can survive. The compromise of his personal incapacity. The return to active diplomatic engagement requires careful choreography to present an image of presidential competence while accommodating the reality of reduced capacity. Wilson's public appearances are limited and carefully staged to minimize the physical demands, while maximizing the symbolic impact of his presence. His participation in meetings is managed to focus his limited energy on the most crucial decisions, while delegating routine matters to advisors who must interpret his intentions based on incomplete guidance from a leader still recovering from serious illness. The final weeks of the Paris Peace Conference unfold under the shadow of Wilson's illness and recovery, with all participants aware that the American president is operating at diminished capacity, but unwilling to acknowledge publicly the extent to which this affects the negotiations. The treaty that emerges from these final sessions bears the marks of compromise forced by Wilson's absence during crucial periods, creating a document that embodies his vision for international cooperation while falling short of the comprehensive framework he originally envisioned. The pandemic illness that struck down the president has thus left its mark not only on his personal health, but on the very structure of international relations that will govern the post-war world. In the basement of what was once Philadelphia General Hospital, beneath layers of dust and decades of institutional memory, cardboard boxes hold secrets that have waited nearly a century to tell their stories. The building itself stands empty now, its wards silent and its corridors dark. But in these forgotten archives lies a treasure trove of human experience from the pandemic. Winter of 1918 to 1919. Each manila folder contains not just medical statistics and treatment notes, but intimate glimpses into lives disrupted, families torn apart, and communities struggling to maintain hope in the face of an invisible enemy that showed no mercy to age, class, or circumstance. Imagine yourself as a researcher in 2019, exactly 100 years after these records were created, carefully lifting the brittle pages that chronicle humanity's encounter with mass illness. The handwriting varies from the careful script of senior physicians to the hurried scrawl of exhausted residents working impossible hours in overwhelmed wards. Some entries are written in the measured language of clinical observation, while others reveal the emotional strain of medical professionals watching helplessly as conventional treatments failed against an enemy that medical science barely understood. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's patient logs from Ward 7 tell a story that statistical reports could never capture. Her careful documentation reveals not just the medical progression of individual cases, but the human drama that unfolded in hospital beds across the city. Patient 347, Mrs. Catherine Murphy, age 32, admitted October 15th with high fever and respiratory distress. Husband deceased from same illness October 3rd. 3 children at home, eldest age 8, caring for younger siblings. The clinical language cannot hide the desperation of a situation where children become orphans and survivors face challenges that extend far beyond medical recovery. The nursing notes, written in margins and on scraps of paper when official forms ran out, provide intimate details about the daily reality of caring for pandemic patients. Nurse Elizabeth Hartford writes, Jimmy Morrison, age 6, calls for his mother every night. Mother, passed Tuesday. Father, unknown whereabouts. Child improves physically but refuses solid food. Requires constant comfort. These fragments reveal how the pandemic created not just medical cases, but humanitarian crises that demanded responses for which no training had prepared the healthcare workers of 1918. Behind each patient number lies a story of disrupted lives and difficult choices. The records show families forced to choose which members to care for when everyone fell ill simultaneously. They document the heartbreaking decisions of parents who had to leave sick children in the hospital's care because they were too ill themselves to provide nursing. They reveal the quiet heroism of neighbors who took in orphaned children and the dedication of hospital workers who stayed at their posts despite their own risk of infection. Dr. James Richardson's research notes, tucked between official patient records, show a physician trying to understand an illness that defied everything he had learned in medical school. His observations about symptom patterns and treatment responses read like detective work, with careful documentation of which remedies showed promise and which proved useless against the pandemic illness. Aspirin provides temporary fever reduction, but no lasting improvement. Cold air baths, suggested by Dr. McAllister, showed no measurable benefit. Patient comfort seems improved by frequent position changes and steady fluid intake. A recovery appears largely dependent on individual constitution. The hospital's admission records paint a picture of an institution overwhelmed by circumstances beyond anyone's previous experience. Normal capacity of 400 patients expanded to over 800 at the height of the crisis, with makeshift wards established in corridors, storage rooms, and any available space that could accommodate a bed. The handwritten logs showed the daily struggle to find space for new patients while managing the complex needs of those already under care. Staff schedules reveal healthcare workers pulling double and triple shifts, with some notes indicating that personnel worked continuously for days before collapsing from exhaustion. Among the most poignant documents are the letters that patients dictated to volunteer scribes when they were too weak to write themselves. Mrs. Eleanor Baxter's final letter to her sister in Chicago captures the uncertainty that characterized so many pandemic experiences. The doctors say, "I am improving, but I feel very weak. Please care for little Sarah if something should happen to me. Tell her that Mama loved her very much and tried to come home. These personal communications, preserved among medical records by accident rather than design, provide glimpses into the emotional landscape of pandemic illness that official documentation rarely captures. The financial records tell their own story of a healthcare system strained beyond its capacity to provide care while maintaining economic viability. Bills went unpaid as entire families fell ill simultaneously, and the hospital's charity care expanded to unprecedented levels as the economic disruption of the pandemic left even middle-class families unable to pay for medical treatment. The accounting ledgers showed the impossible mathematics of trying to maintain operations while providing care to patients who had no means of payment in communities that had been economically devastated by widespread illness and death. Dr. Thornfield's private journal, discovered among her professional papers, reveals the psychological toll that treating pandemic patients took on healthcare providers. I have lost count of the young mothers who have died in my care, leaving behind children who may never recover from such loss. Sleep comes poorly when every quiet moment brings memories of faces I could not save. Yet tomorrow will bring new patients, and we must continue to offer what help we can, even when that help feels desperately insufficient. The records document innovations born of necessity as medical staff adapted to treating an illness for which no proven remedies existed. Nurses developed new techniques for managing respiratory distress, using available materials to create makeshift equipment when standard supplies ran out. Physicians experimented with treatment combinations, carefully noting which approaches seemed to provide relief even when they could not effect cures. These adaptive responses, preserved in daily logs and treatment notes, show how medical professionals learn through trial and error to provide comfort when cure remained elusive. The correspondence files contain letters from other hospitals, sharing information about treatment approaches and patient management strategies. These professional communications reveal a medical community trying to learn from each pandemic wave, sharing knowledge about which interventions showed promise and which proved ineffective. Dr. Richardson's exchanges with colleagues in Boston and Chicago document the collaborative effort to understand an illness that challenged every assumption about infectious disease treatment. The children's ward records carry particular emotional weight, documenting cases where entire families were hospitalized simultaneously and children were left without adult family members to advocate for their care. Nurse Patricia Sullivan's notes describe the improvised family structures that developed among young patients, with older children comforting younger ones and hospital staff stepping into parental roles that went far beyond medical care. Mary Sullivan, age 9, has taken responsibility for helping younger patients eat their meals. This demonstrates remarkable maturity for her age, though occasionally breaks down crying when she thinks no one is watching. The hospital's emergency protocols, hastily written and frequently revised during the crisis, show an institution learning to operate under conditions that had never been anticipated. Standard procedures were abandoned as staff shortages made normal operations impossible. New guidelines were created for managing patient flow when every bed was occupied and corridors served as overflow wards. These operational documents reveal the practical challenges of maintaining medical care, when every assumption about hospital capacity and staffing had been rendered obsolete by the scale of the emergency. The mortality records, kept with careful attention to detail despite the chaos of the crisis, tell a story that transcends mere statistics. Each entry represents not just a life lost, but families disrupted, economic relationships severed, and communities diminished by the absence of individuals who had contributed to the fabric of daily life. The ledgers show patterns that illuminate the pandemic's disproportionate impact on certain populations, while documenting the democratic nature of an illness that ultimately spared no social class or age group entirely. Dr. Thornfield's final entries written as the pandemic wave began to subside in early 1919. Reflect on lessons learned and changes that the crisis had brought to medical practice. We have learned to value simple human comfort as highly as any medical intervention. The presence of caring individuals often provided more relief than our limited pharmaceutical options. Future medical training must acknowledge that healing involves not just technical knowledge, but the capacity to provide hope and dignity to patients facing circumstances beyond their control. These reflections, preserved by accident among routine medical records, offer insights into how the pandemic changed not just medical procedures, but the fundamental understanding of healthcare's human dimension. The deeper you delve into these archived records, the more you realize that the most profound stories often exist in the margins, literally and figuratively. Between the official entries and statistical summaries, hospital staff recorded observations that revealed the pandemic's impact on human behavior, social relationships, and the fundamental ways that communities respond to existential threats. These marginal notes, never intended for official documentation, provide glimpses into the psychological and social dimensions of mass illness that formal medical records rarely capture. In the corner of a patient intake form, someone has written, in pencil, "Mrs. O'Brien refuses to give contact information for next of kin, claims they're all gone anyway." This simple notation opens a window into the profound isolation that the pandemic created, where survivors found themselves cut off not just from their usual social networks, but from the very concept of family and community support that had previously defined their identities. The records contain dozens of such entries, documenting people who had become islands of survival in a world where their familiar connections had been severed by illness and death. The shift schedules, originally designed to track staff availability, inadvertently document the heroic dedication of healthcare workers who stayed at their posts, despite personal risk and family obligations. Nurse Mary Catherine's schedule shows her working 18-hour shifts for 2 weeks straight during October 1918, with a note in the margin indicating, Kate, that her own daughter was ill at home, but she could not leave the hospital due to critical staff shortages. Dr. Samuel Morrison's time logs revealed similar dedication, with notations showing him sleeping in the hospital for days at a time to remain available for emergency cases. The supply requisition forms tell a story of improvisation and resourcefulness as medical staff adapted to shortages that affected everything from basic medications to bed linens. Orders for traditional medical supplies are crossed out and replaced with requests for materials that could be repurposed for patient care, cotton fabric that could be torn into bandages, household soap that could substitute for medical antiseptics, and kitchen utensils that could serve as medical instruments when standard equipment was unavailable or contaminated. These documents reveal how healthcare providers learned to provide professional medical care using whatever materials they could obtain. Among the most revealing discoveries are the informal patient notes that staff members wrote for their own reference, often in violation of official record-keeping policies. These personal observations capture details about patient behavior and family dynamics that formal medical documentation would never include. Little Tommy Henderson talks constantly about his dog, Patches. Says Patches is waiting for him to come home. Family reports dog died 3 weeks ago. The child has not been told. Such entries reveal the complex psychological challenges that healthcare workers faced in caring for patients whose emotional needs were as pressing as their medical requirements. The correspondence between Philadelphia General and other hospitals reveals a broader network of medical professionals sharing information and resources during the crisis. Dr. Richards' letters to colleagues in Boston describe experimental treatments being tried at different institutions, while incoming mail documents the nationwide search for effective remedies against an illness that defied conventional treatment approaches. This professional correspondence, filed among routine administrative papers, shows how the medical community attempted to learn collectively from the pandemic experience. The hospital's visitor logs, normally routine administrative records, tell poignant stories about the barriers that infection control created between patients and their families. Entries show the gradual restriction of visiting privileges as the pandemic intensified, eventually limiting family contact to brief conversations through ward windows or messages passed through hospital staff. The emotional impact of these separations appears in staff notes about patients who deteriorated more rapidly when deprived of family contact, suggesting that isolation itself became a complicating factor in patient recovery. Financial records revealed the pandemic's devastating economic impact on individual families and the hospital's operations. Patient accounts show bills that accumulated while entire families were hospitalized, creating debt burdens that surviving members could never realistically pay. The hospital's charity care records expanded dramatically during this period, documenting cases where middle-class families found themselves dependent on free medical care after breadwinners died or became too ill to work. These financial documents illuminate the pandemic's role in disrupting economic relationships that had previously seemed stable and permanent. The medical students' training logs provide unique insights into how the pandemic transformed medical education. Standard curricula were abandoned as students were pressed into service, caring for patients, learning through direct experience rather than classroom instruction. Their notes revealed the psychological challenges of learning medicine during a crisis that overwhelmed even experienced practitioners. Today, I watched Dr. Thornfield cry after losing 3 patients in one morning. She apologized and told me that medicine sometimes requires grieving for people we cannot save. No textbook prepared me for understanding that healing involves accepting failure. Among the most unusual documents are the informal surveys that Dr. Richardson conducted among recovering patients, attempting to understand factors that might influence survival rates. These questionnaires, never part of official hospital policy, asked about family history, living conditions, diet, and social relationships before illness. The responses revealed patterns that formal medical statistics might miss, suggestions that patients with strong family support networks recovered more frequently, that crowded living conditions increased severity of illness, and that psychological factors played roles in recovery that medical science was only beginning to acknowledge. The nursing staff's personal logbooks document the emotional toll of caring for patients during a crisis that challenged every assumption about professional medical care. These private records, kept separately from official documentation, reveal the strategies that healthcare workers developed for maintaining their own psychological health while providing care in circumstances that would break many people's spirits. Nurse Hartford writes, "I have learned to find small victories in days filled with loss. When Mrs. Patterson smiled for the first time in a week, it felt like a medical breakthrough. When little Sarah ate her entire breakfast, it seemed as important as any medicine we could provide." The hospital's emergency planning documents, hastily created as the pandemic unfolded, show institutional adaptation in real time. Protocols were written and rewritten as staff learned through experience what worked and what failed. The evacuation plans were developed for transferring patients if the hospital became too overwhelmed to function. Resource allocation guidelines were created to help staff make impossible decisions about how to distribute limited supplies among patients with equal claims to care. These operational documents revealed the practical challenges of maintaining medical ethics when normal resources and procedures became inadequate. The personal effects inventory, maintained for patients who died without family contact, provides glimpses into lives interrupted by sudden illness. Lists of belongings reveal individual stories: a woman carrying letters from a son serving in France, to a man whose pockets contained photographs of grandchildren he was traveling to visit, a young mother whose purse held a child's drawing labeled for Mama when she gets well. These mundane objects, cataloged by hospital staff who who had no idea of their emotional significance, serve as monuments to lives cut short and relationships severed by pandemic illness. The hospital's internal communication memos document the gradual breakdown of normal administrative procedures as the crisis overwhelmed institutional capacity. Standard reporting requirements were suspended when staff had no time for paperwork. Tight mental meetings were canceled when key personnel became ill or were working impossible schedules. Quality control procedures were modified when normal oversight became impossible due to staff shortages. These administrative records revealed how institutions adapted their operations to continue functioning under conditions that challenged every assumption about organizational management. As you continue your exploration through these archival treasures, you begin to understand that each document represents not just information, but an archaeological layer of human experience, preserved by accident rather than intention. The papers themselves tell their own stories, some crisp and well-preserved, others stained with substances you prefer not to identify, and many bearing the physical evidence of the crisis they document. Water damage from a burst pipe in 1923 has created abstract watercolor patterns across patient charts, while mouse nibbles from decades of storage have created lace-like borders around mortality statistics, giving these grim documents an inadvertent beauty that speaks to time's power to transform even the most tragic records into something approaching art. The handwriting analysis alone reveals layers of meaning that official transcriptions could never capture. Dr. Thornfield's normally precise script deteriorates visibly over the course of the pandemic months, evolving from careful medical penmanship to the hurried scrawl of someone working beyond the limits of human endurance. In her final entries, you can see where her hand trembled with exhaustion, or where tears have blurred ink, and where she stopped mid-sentence, perhaps called away to another emergency, or simply to overcome with emotion to continue writing. These physical traces of stress and grief provide a more immediate connection to the historical experience than any formal historical account could achieve. The layering of different inks and pencils across individual patient records tells stories of multiple staff members contributing to care over time. Dr. Richardson's initial assessments in black ink are followed by nursing notes in blue, with penciled updates that may have been added days or weeks later when writing instruments were scarce. Some entries are written in what appears to be purple ink made from berries or other improvised materials when commercial supplies ran out. These variations in writing materials serve as inadvertent documentation of the supply shortages that affected even basic office functions during the crisis. Hidden among routine medical records are documents that reveal the creative ways that hospital staff maintained their humanity during an inhuman crisis. Someone, probably a nurse, created hand-drawn greeting cards for patients who had no family visitors, using whatever paper and coloring materials were available. These amateur artworks, tucked between official forms, show crude but heartfelt drawings of flowers, birds, and sunshine, intended to bring hope to people who had little reason for optimism. The discovery of these informal art projects illuminates the emotional intelligence of healthcare workers who understood that healing required more than medical intervention. The margins of official forms became repositories for personal observations that staff members needed to record but couldn't include in formal documentation. A notation beside a patient's name reads, "Speaks frequently about wanting to see the ocean one more time. Never left Philadelphia, but dreams of visiting Atlantic City." Another marginal note observes, "Patient laughs when recounting stories about her cat, despite severe illness." Animal stories seem to provide comfort that medical treatment cannot. These human details, preserved by accident in the borders of bureaucratic forms, reveal the attention to individual dignity that characterized the best medical care during the crisis. The evolution of hospital policies can be traced through successive revisions of constant treatment protocols, each version reflecting lessons learned from previous failures. The original admission procedures, designed for normal patient loads and routine illnesses were crossed out and replaced with emergency protocols that could handle mass casualties. These revised procedures were then further modified as staff learned which emergency measures worked and which created additional problems. The documents show institutional learning in real time, revealing how organizations adapted to unprecedented challenges through trial and error. Among the most poignant discoveries are the incomplete records, patient files that end abruptly without explanation, treatment notes that break off mid-sentence, and correspondence that was never finished or sent. These fragmentary documents speak to the chaos of the crisis more powerfully than complete records could, suggesting lives interrupted not just by illness, but by the overwhelming demands placed on healthcare workers who had insufficient time to maintain normal documentation standards. The gaps in the record become as meaningful as the information that was preserved. The hospital supply inventories, tracked with obsessive detail during normal operations, become increasingly sparse and desperate during the pandemic months. Early entries list standard medical supplies in normal quantities, but as the crisis deepened, the records show improvised solutions that reveal the creative problem-solving required to maintain patient care. Bed sheets were cut into bandages, kitchen utensils were sterilized for surgical use, and household cleaning products were repurposed as medical antiseptics. These inventory adjustments document the transformation of a medical institution to something resembling a field hospital. The personal correspondence found among official papers provides intimate glimpses into the lives of hospital staff during the crisis. Dr. Richardson's unfinished letter to his wife describes the impossible decisions he faces daily. I must choose which patients receive the limited oxygen supplies we have available. These are choices no physician should have to make, yet circumstances offer no alternatives. The letter breaks off without signature or conclusion, presumably interrupted by another medical emergency that demanded immediate attention. The discovery of patient artwork hidden in medical files reveals creative expression that flourished even under the most dire circumstances. Children's drawings, created with whatever materials could be found, show surprisingly optimistic scenes, families reunited, people playing outside, and animals living in peaceful harmony. These artworks, preserved by staff who recognize their emotional value, demonstrate the human capacity to maintain hope even when surrounded by evidence that hope might be misplaced. The hospital's visitor restriction policies evolved through multiple revisions as administrators tried to balance infection control with patients' emotional needs. Early versions completely prohibited family visits, but subsequent revisions show administrators learning that isolation itself became a factor in patient decline. Later policies allowed limited visits through windows or with extreme precautions, acknowledging that human connection served therapeutic purposes that purely medical interventions could not provide. These policy changes reflect growing understanding of medicine's psychological dimensions. The financial records reveal not just the economic impact of the pandemic, but the creative approaches that administrators developed to maintain operations when normal funding sources became inadequate. Bills were forgiven for families who had lost breadwinners. Payment plans were extended indefinitely for survivors struggling with economic disruption. And wealthy patients were quietly charged higher rates to subsidize charity care for those who could not pay. These financial accommodations, documented in administrative notes, show institutional adaptation to circumstances that challenged every assumption about hospital economics. The medication logs documented the desperate search for effective treatments against an illness that resisted conventional remedies. Entries show experimentation with combinations of available drugs, careful notation of which approaches seemed to provide relief, and honest acknowledgement when treatments proved ineffective. The pharmaceutical records reveal medical professionals learning through systematic observation when scientific knowledge proved inadequate, developing empirical approaches to treatment that would later inform more sophisticated understanding of respiratory illness management. Among the most surprising discoveries are the educational materials that hospital staff created to help families care for patients at home when hospital beds became unavailable. These handwritten instruction sheets, copied multiple times for distribution, provide practical advice about nursing care, nutrition, symptom monitoring that family members could implement without medical training. The existence of these informal educational materials reveals the hospital's recognition that effective pandemic response required extending medical knowledge beyond professional boundaries. The staff's scheduling records tell stories of human endurance that challenge belief. Nurses worked shifts that extended for days at a time. Physicians slept in hospital corridors between patient rounds. And support staff took on medical responsibilities that were far beyond their normal duties. The scheduling documents show administrators trying to maintain adequate staffing while acknowledging that normal work expectations had become impossible. These operational records provide evidence of collective sacrifice that statistics about healthcare worker mortality could never fully capture. The final entries in many of these records, written as the pandemic began to subside in early 1919, reflect on experiences that changed everyone who lived through them. Dr. Thornfield's concluding observations expect not just about medical lessons learned, but about fundamental changes in understanding human resilience and vulnerability. We have witnessed both the worst and best of human nature compressed into circumstances that tested every assumption about civilization and caring. The patients who survived often did so through strength of spirit that medical science cannot measure, while those we lost taught us about dignity and suffering that no textbook could convey. In the exclusive Whitmore Sanitarium, nestled among the rolling hills of Connecticut, where wealthy families sent their afflicted members for discreet medical care, a different kind of pandemic story unfolds behind mahogany doors and crystal decanters. Here, in the physician's private lounge on the 3rd floor of the main building, medical professionals who serve the social elite gather each evening to discuss cases that will never appear in public health statistics, patients whose names cannot be mentioned in professional journals, and treatment approaches that money can buy but medical science cannot guarantee. Imagine yourself settling into one of the leather armchairs that circled the lounge's marble fireplace, listening to conversations that revealed how the pandemic affected those accustomed to purchasing immunity from life's ordinary hardships. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, chief of staff at Whitmore, swirls his evening brandy while describing the peculiar challenges of treating wealthy patients who cannot accept that their money offers no protection against microscopic enemies. Mrs. Vandermeer insists that her usual suite in the East Wing be completely redecorated before she will consent to isolation treatment. She believes that aesthetic surroundings will influence her recovery, and perhaps she is not entirely wrong, though her reasoning stems from privilege rather than medical understanding. The lounge itself reflects the sanitarium's clientele. Persian rugs cover polished hardwood floors. Oil paintings of pastoral scenes hang between floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over manicured gardens, and the air carries the mingled scents of expensive tobacco and leather-bound medical journals. The furniture has been arranged to allow for the careful distances that pandemic precautions require, but even social distancing takes on a different character when practiced among oriental screens and marble side tables that cost more than most people's annual income. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, grandson of the sanitarium's founder, describes the complex negotiations required to convince wealthy families that their loved ones need the same isolation protocols as common patients in public hospitals. Senator Morrison's wife demanded that her personal maid be allowed to continue daily attendance during her quarantine period. When I explained the infection risks, she offered to pay for the maid to live in isolation as well, as if money could create a bubble of safety within the larger danger. These conversations reveal how privilege attempts to negotiate with pandemic realities that recognize no social distinctions. The evening discussions in the lounge often focus on the psychological challenges of treating patients who have never experienced situations they cannot control through wealth or influence. Dr. Margaret Ashworth, one of the few female physicians on the sanitarium's staff, describes the particular difficulties of caring for society women whose identities have been built around social activities that quarantine makes impossible. Mrs. Hartford James speaks constantly about the charity balls she is missing, the garden parties she cannot attend, and the social obligations that her illness prevents her from fulfilling. Her distress about these social disruptions often seems greater than her concern about the physical symptoms of her illness. The sanitarium's approach to pandemic treatment reflects both medical necessity and the expectations of clientele accustomed to personalized service. Each patient receives private nursing care around the clock, with staff members who have been specially trained in both medical protocols and the social requirements of serving wealthy families. Treatment rooms are equipped with amenities that would be unimaginable in public hospitals, private bathrooms with imported fixtures, temperature-controlled environments, specially prepared meals served on fine china even when patients can barely taste food due to their illness. Dr. Blackwood's case notes, shared discreetly among his colleagues during these evening gatherings, revealed the complex medical challenges that arise when treating patients whose lifestyles have been built around habits that pandemic precautions make dangerous. Mr. Carnegie Whitney insists on maintaining his daily cigar ritual, claiming that tobacco smoke will protect him from airborne contagion. His reasoning is medically unsound, but his smoking has become such a central part of his identity that prohibiting it creates psychological distress that may impede his recovery more than the physical habit harms his respiratory function. The conversations in the lounge reveal how even the most privileged members of society cannot escape the democratic nature of pandemic illness, though their resources allow them to experience that illness in circumstances that ordinary people could never imagine. Private railroad cars bring patients to the sanitarium without exposing them to public transportation risks. Personal physicians travel from distant cities to consult on cases, creating medical conferences that would be impossible for public hospital patients. Experimental treatments, available only to those who can afford them, offer hope that may be false but provide psychological comfort that money can indeed purchase. Dr. Ashworth describes a unique challenge of treating patients whose families have the resources to seek multiple medical opinions simultaneously, creating conflicts between different physicians' approaches that ordinary patients would never encounter. The Rothschild family consulted specialists in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia before bringing their daughter here. Each physician recommended different treatment protocols, and the family now expects us to implement all recommendations simultaneously, as if medical care were a matter of combining the best available options rather than choosing the most appropriate single approach. The sanitarium's isolation protocols reveal how luxury can be maintained, even under medical restrictions that elsewhere create Spartan conditions. Private dining rooms allow families to take meals together while maintaining appropriate distances from other patients. Personal libraries are stocked with books, chosen specifically for each patient's interest and reading level during recovery. Exercise facilities are arranged to provide physical therapy that maintains both medical benefit and social propriety, with equipment that would be familiar in exclusive health clubs rather than medical institutions. The evening discussions among physicians reveal the moral complexities of providing medical care that acknowledges class distinctions while attempting to maintain professional standards that should apply equally to all patients. Dr. Whitmore describes the ethical challenges of allocating scarce medical resources, such as oxygen equipment and experimental treatments, when wealthy patients can afford to purchase supplies that public hospitals desperately need. We have received requests to sell our surplus oxygen tanks to city hospitals, but our board members argue that our primary obligation is to our paying patients, even when those patients' needs may be less urgent than those of patients elsewhere. The lounge conversations often turn to observations about how the pandemic has affected the social dynamics among the wealthy families who formed the sanitarium's clientele. Dr. Blackwood notes that quarantine has created unusual intimacy among people who previously interacted primarily through formal social protocols. Families who have never spent extended time together in private settings are discovering aspects of each other's personalities that elaborate social events typically conceal. Some find this forced intimacy strengthening to their relationships, while others discover incompatibilities that wealth and social position had previously helped them avoid. The physicians discuss case studies that reveal how different social classes approach illness and recovery, comparing their wealthy patients' responses to pandemic illness with their colleagues. Reports from public institutions. Dr. Ashworth observes that wealthy patients often experience greater psychological distress from the loss of social activities and luxury amenities than from the physical symptoms of illness itself. Mrs. Pemberton recovered her physical health relatively quickly, but fell into profound depression when she realized that her usual winter social season would be entirely canceled due to quarantine requirements. The evening brandy conversations reveal how the sanitarium staff navigates a complex relationship between medical authority and social privilege when treating patients who are accustomed to having their preferences determine every aspect of their daily lives. Dr. Whitmore describes the delicate negotiations required to convince wealthy patients to follow medical advice that conflicts with their personal preferences or social obligations. Mr. Hartford insists that his business obligations require him to maintain daily communication with his offices in 3 cities, explaining that his recovery depends on rest and minimal stimulation, requires diplomatic skills that medical school never taught. Codd said the lounge discussions also explore how the pandemic has created new forms of luxury service. As wealthy families seek to purchase protection from risks that money cannot eliminate. Private medical facilities offer screening services for household staff. Personal physicians provide house calls with elaborate safety protocols. Specialized cleaning services use experimental disinfection methods that cost more than most people's monthly income. These services create the illusion of purchased safety while providing psychological comfort that may be more valuable than their actual medical benefit. As the evening deepens and the fire settles into glowing embers, the physicians' conversations turn toward more philosophical reflections on what they have witnessed during these pandemic months. Dr. Blackwood's 30 years of medical practice have included treating both charity cases and society families. Speaks quietly about the unexpected lessons that crisis has taught about human nature across social boundaries. I have observed that physical pain creates a democracy that wealth cannot circumvent. Mrs. Astor's fever causes the same discomfort as a factory worker's, and her labored breathing responds to the same basic nursing care that any patient requires. Lounge's atmosphere, with its carefully maintained elegance and masculine comfort, provides a stark contrast to the conversations about suffering and mortality that fill these evening gatherings. Dr. Ashworth adjusts her position in the leather chair, mindful of the social protocols that still govern even these informal medical discussions among colleagues. As one of the few women in the sanitarium's physician staff, she navigates not only the medical challenges of the pandemic, also the social expectations that accompany treating wealthy female patients who view illness as a temporary disruption to their carefully orchestrated lives. The evening ritual of sharing difficult cases has evolved during the pandemic months into something resembling group therapy for medical professionals who rarely have opportunities to discuss the emotional toll of their work. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, heir to the sanitarium's founding family, Fortune finds himself in the unique position of treating patients whose wealth rivals his own, creating complex dynamics where medical authority must coexist with social equality. When Senator Morrison questioned my treatment recommendations, He was not simply challenging my medical judgment, but asserting the social prerogative of someone accustomed to having his opinions matter more than expertise. The fire's warmth cannot entirely dispel the chill that settles over the room when conversations turn to the patients they have lost. Cases where all the advantages that money could provide proved insufficient against the pandemic's inexorable progression. Dr. Blackwood speaks in measured tones about Mrs. Carnick-Mellon's family spared no expense seeking treatments from specialists across 2 continents. Key, yet who succumbed to the illness with the same finality that claimed factory workers and shop clerks. Her private railroad car brought the most renowned physicians to her bedside, but expertise could not overcome the fundamental limitations of medical knowledge when confronting an enemy that science had never encountered. The discussions reveal how the pandemic has disrupted social hierarchies in ways that extend beyond medical treatment into the very foundations of how wealthy families understand their place in the world. Dr. Ashworth describes patients who struggle not just with physical illness, but with the existential crisis of discovering that their accustomed immunity from common problems does not extend to microscopic threats. Mrs. Pemberton Hayes asked me repeatedly whether there was some mistake, some reason why she had contracted an illness that she associated with poor people living in crowded conditions. It's the concept that disease could cross social boundaries was more difficult for her to accept than the physical symptoms. The sanitarium's evening routines, observed through the lounge's windows, reveal how pandemic precautions have altered even the most privileged environments. Patients take their evening constitutionals along garden paths that have been marked to ensure proper distancing. Their expensive evening wear adapted with silk masks that coordinate with their outfits. The sight of wealthy invalids maintaining social graces while following medical protocols creates a tableau that captures the pandemic's strange intersection of necessity and privilege. Dr. Whitmore shares observations about how different generations of wealthy families have responded to pandemic restrictions, noting that older patients who lived through previous national crises seem better equipped to accept current limitations than younger family members who have never experienced circumstances beyond their control. Young Mr. Rothschild cannot comprehend why his engagement party must be postponed indefinitely, while his grandfather, who lived through economic panics and family tragedies, adapted to quarantine requirements with resignation that suggests familiarity with life's unpredictability. The evening conversations inevitably turn to comparisons between their experiences. Treating wealthy patients and reports from colleagues working in public institutions. These discussions reveal not just differences in resources and amenities, but fundamental variations in how different social classes approach illness, recovery, and mortality. Dr. Blackwood notes that wealthy patients often view illness as a problem to be solved through the application of sufficient resources, while their colleagues report that working-class patients more readily accept illness as part of life's inherent uncertainty. The lounges, bookshelves lined with medical journals and classical literature serve as backdrop for discussions about how the pandemic experience is being documented and remembered. The physicians recognize that their wealthy patients' stories will likely be preserved in family archives and private correspondence, while the experiences of ordinary patients may be lost to a historical record. Dr. Ashworth expresses concern about this disparity in historical preservation, noting that future understanding of the pandemic may be distorted by an overemphasis on how it affected the privileged classes. As the evening progresses, conversations become more personal, with physicians sharing their own struggles to maintain professional objectivity while treating patients whose resources allow them to demand extraordinary measures that may provide no medical benefit. Dr. Whitmore describes the ethical complexity of prescribing expensive experimental treatments that wealthy families insist upon, even when medical evidence suggests these interventions offer little hope of success. The ability to purchase hope, even false hope, creates medical situations that public hospital physicians never encounter. The discussions reveal how the pandemic has affected not just patient care, but the physician's own social relationships within the wealthy communities they serve. Dr. Blackwood notes that his professional obligations sometimes conflict with social expectations when patients, families expect him to attend social gatherings that medical prudence suggests he should avoid. The boundary between physician and social equal becomes complicated when treating patients who consider themselves as peers rather than as clients. The evening ritual concludes with reflections on what lessons the pandemic experience might offer for future medical practice and social understanding. The physicians recognize that they have witnessed unique insights into human behavior under extreme stress. Observations that could inform not just medical treatment, but broader understanding of how crisis reveals character across social boundaries. Dr. Ashworth notes that the pandemic has demonstrated both the limitations of privilege in protecting against natural threats and the ways that resources can ease suffering even when they cannot prevent it entirely. The last embers in the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the lounge's paneled walls as the evening's final conversation unfolds. Among physicians who have witnessed humanity's encounter with an invisible enemy that recognizes no social distinctions, Dr. Blackwood refills his brandy snifter with the deliberate movements of someone who has learned to savor these quiet moments between the demands of caring for patients whose wealth cannot purchase immunity from suffering. The sanitarium's evening silence, broken only by the distant sound of a patient's cough echoing through the corridors, serves as a constant reminder that even in the most privileged medical facilities, the fundamental realities of illness and mortality remain unchanged. The physician's reflections turn to observations about how the pandemic has revealed essential truths. It's about human nature that transcends social class, economic status, and cultural background. Dr. Ashworth speaks thoughtfully about Mrs. Pemberton Whitney, a steel heiress whose illness progressed with the same inexorable pattern seen in patients from every social stratum. When fever reaches 104 degrees, the body responds according to biological imperatives that make no distinction between inherited wealth and inherited poverty. Mrs. Whitney's platinum jewelry provided no more protection than a factory worker's wedding ring, and her recovery depended on the same basic nursing care that sustains any seriously ill patient. The conversations reveal how pandemic conditions have created unexpected intimacies between physicians and patients, breaking down social barriers that normally maintain professional distance in elite medical practice. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore describes sitting through the night with Senator Morrison during his crisis period, holding the politician's hand while he struggled for breath. The level of physical contact that social protocol would normally prohibit between men of their respective social positions. In moments of genuine medical crisis, the usual conventions that govern social interaction become irrelevant. A United States senator gasping for air requires the same basic human comfort as any frightened patient. And providing that comfort becomes more important than maintaining proper social distance. The lounge's elegant appointments, crystal decanters, leather-bound books, Persian carpets create an incongruous backdrop for discussions about the democracy of death that the pandemic has revealed. Dr. Blackwood notes that despite all the advantages their wealthy patients enjoy in terms of private rooms, personal nursing care, and access to experimental treatments, the fundamental experience of serious illness remains essentially the same across social boundaries. Pain and fear affect the nervous system identically regardless of bank account balances. Mrs. Carnegie Mellon's anxiety about her children's future during her illness expressed the same parental concerns that consume any dying mother. Whether she leaves behind trust funds or debts, the physicians discuss how their wealthy patients' families have responded to the realization that money cannot purchase certainty about medical outcomes. Some families have doubled their spending on medical care, seeking additional specialists and experimental treatments, as if enough expertise and expense could guarantee recovery. Others have displayed unexpected acceptance, recognizing that their resources can provide comfort and dignity during illness, but cannot alter its fundamental course. Dr. Ashworth observes that the families who adapt most successfully to pandemic realities are often those who have previously experienced loss or adversity that taught them about life's inherent uncertainty. The evening's discussions reveal how the pandemic has affected not just patient care, but the social dynamics within the wealthy communities that the sanitarium serves. Dr. Whitmore describes how quarantine requirements have disrupted the elaborate social networks that normally define elite society, creating isolation that wealth cannot entirely overcome. Mrs. Asterley speaks more about missing her weekly bridge games than about her physical symptoms. The social activities that previously structured her identity have disappeared, leaving her to confront illness without the distractions that had previously helped her. Avoid contemplating mortality. The physicians share observations about how different patients have found meaning and purpose during their illness, noting that those who adapt most successfully often discover internal resources that their previous lifestyle of external stimulation had left undeveloped. Dr. Blackwood speaks about Mr. Hartford James, a railroad magnate who used his recovery time to write detailed letters to his children, expressing emotions and sharing wisdom that his busy professional life had never allowed him to communicate. Forced rest created opportunities for reflection and connection that his previous schedule had made impossible. His illness, while physically debilitating, enabled emotional growth that may have been his first genuine personal development in decades. The sanitarium's unique position serving wealthy patients has provided the physicians with insights to how different social classes approach death and dying. Observations that challenge common assumptions about the relationship between money and mortality. Dr. Ashworth notes that wealthy patients often struggle more with loss of control during illness than with physical discomfort. Having been accustomed to purchasing solutions for every problem they encounter, Mr. Pemberton Carnegie became increasingly agitated, not because his symptoms worsened, but because he could not direct his recovery the way he managed his business interests. The helplessness that illness imposes proved more disturbing to him than the actual pain. The evening conversations include reflections on how the pandemic experience has changed the physicians' own understanding of their profession and their relationships with patients across social boundaries. Dr. Whitmore speaks about discovering that the most meaningful aspects of medical care presence during suffering, skilled observation of illness, progression, and the ability to provide hope without false promises, regardless of the settings, luxury, or the patient's social status. The fundamental skills that make someone an effective physician translate equally well whether practiced in a charity ward or a private suite. Wealthy patients require the same careful attention to symptoms, the same compassionate presence during crisis, and the same honest communication about prognosis. The discussions reveal how the pandemic has created unexpected opportunities for wealthy patients to develop empathy and understanding for less privileged people facing similar medical challenges. Dr. Blackwood describes patients who have begun contributing to public health initiatives in charity hospitals after their own experience with serious illness gave them first-hand understanding of medical vulnerability. Mrs. Carnegie Whitney established a fund for public hospital nurses after her recovery, stating that her own nursing care made her realize the skill and dedication required for such work. Her illness created connections to broader human experience that her previous social isolation had prevented. The physicians reflect on how their evening discussions in the lounge have evolved during the pandemic months, from routine case reviews to deeper explorations of what their unusual professional position has taught them about human nature, social relationships, and the meaning of medical care. These conversations have become a form of professional development that medical schools could never provide, offering insights into human behavior under extreme stress that will inform their practice long after the pandemic subsides. As the fire burns down to ash and the evening draws toward its close, the physicians recognize that they have witnessed historical events from a unique vantage point that has revealed truths about privilege, mortality, and human resilience that few people will ever have the opportunity to observe. Dr. Ashworth speaks for her colleagues when she notes that caring for wealthy patients during the pandemic has demonstrated both the limitations and the proper uses of economic advantage when confronting life's fundamental challenges. The final moments of their evening gathering are spent in contemplative silence. Physician absorbed in private reflections on the day's cases and the larger lessons that the pandemic continues to teach. The stenariums, quiet corridors, the distant sound of night nursing duties, and the comfortable surroundings that money has provided create a peaceful environment for processing experiences that will remain with them for the rest of their professional lives. Tomorrow will bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to apply what they have learned about caring for human beings, whose wealth cannot purchase immunity from the essential vulnerability that defines the human condition. The evening concludes with the unspoken understanding that their privileged position as physicians to the wealthy during a democratic disaster has provided them with insights that carry responsibilities extending beyond their immediate patients to the broader understanding of how society should respond when crisis reveals the fundamental equality that underlies all human experience, regardless of the social distinctions that normally separate people into different worlds of opportunity and comfort. As our journey through the pandemic winter of 1918-1919 draws to its close, we find ourselves returned to the present moment, to the safety of our own time and the comfort of our own beds. The voices we have heard tonight, the cautious shopkeeper checking his morning deliveries, the powerful president brought low by invisible enemies, the dedicated physicians documenting humanity's struggle in forgotten hospital records, and the elite doctors discovering that privilege cannot purchase immunity from life's deepest vulnerabilities, all speak to us across the century that separates their experience from our own. These stories, preserved in the amber of historical record and archaeological discovery, remind us that every generation believes its challenges are unprecedented, its struggles unique, and its survival uncertain. Yet the people of 1918 and 1919 navigated their crisis with the same fundamental human resources that we carry within ourselves: the capacity for adaptation, the instinct for mutual care, and the quiet courage that emerges when circumstances demand more than we believe we can provide. Their gauze masks in careful distances, their reorganized social lives and modified business practices, their acceptance of isolation as the price of survival, all demonstrate humanity's remarkable ability to find new ways of maintaining connection and community, even when traditional forms of gathering become dangerous. The shopkeeper's daily routine is conducted behind fabric barriers and across carefully measured spaces, reveals how ordinary people created meaning and purpose in circumstances that would have seemed impossible just months before their crisis began. His careful inventory of depleted shelves, his patient service to masked customers, and his evening walks through empty streets all speak to the human capacity for finding dignity and purpose in constrained circumstances. His story reminds us that survival during crisis often depends less on dramatic heroism than on the quiet persistence of daily routines adapted to new realities. President Wilson's encounter with the pandemic illness that nearly claimed his life at the crucial moment of international diplomacy illustrates how even the most powerful individuals remain subject to forces beyond their control. His fever-clouded negotiations, his wife's protective vigil, and his physician's careful medical bulletins all demonstrate that leadership during crisis requires not just political skill, but personal resilience in the face of circumstances that humble human ambition. His story reveals how individual health and collective welfare become inseparably intertwined. When crisis affects not just populations, but the people responsible for guiding society's response. The forgotten hospital records, discovered in basement archives and preserved by accident rather than intention, speak most directly to the individual human cost of collective catastrophe. Each patient file represents not just medical statistics, but disrupted families, economic relationships severed by death, and communities that learn to function with reduced populations and altered social structures. These documents remind us that behind every historical crisis lie countless individual stories of loss, adaptation, and quiet courage that statistical reports cannot capture, but that define the true human meaning of collective survival. The physicians' evening conversations in their exclusive lounge reveal how crisis creates unexpected equalities that transcend social boundaries, while simultaneously highlighting the ways that privilege can ease suffering even when it cannot prevent it entirely. Their observations about wealthy patients discovering their own mortality lead families learning to accept circumstances beyond their control. For the fundamental democracy of physical pain and fear provide insights into human nature that only extreme circumstances can reveal. Their discussions illuminate how crisis strips away social pretenses to reveal the common humanity that underlies all cultural distinctions. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep in circumstances that the people of 1918 could hardly have imagined with medical knowledge they never possessed, safety measures they could never have implemented, and global communication systems that connect us instantaneously to information about health and welfare around the world. You can rest in the knowledge that human beings have faced seemingly impossible challenges before and found ways not just to survive, but to maintain the compassion, creativity, and community connections that make survival meaningful. The gauze masks of 1918 gave way to normal faces. The empty streets filled again with the sounds of commerce and social gathering, in the careful distances that seemed so unnatural, eventually relaxed into the comfortable proximity that defines human community in peaceful times. The pandemic that seemed to threaten the very fabric of civilization became, instead, another chapter in humanity's long story of adaptation and resilience, another demonstration of our species' remarkable capacity to find new ways of caring for each other when traditional approaches become insufficient. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the quiet confidence that comes from understanding how previous generations navigated their darkest moments with resources no greater than those you possess, the ability to adapt daily routines to new requirements, a willingness to care for others despite personal risk, the capacity to find meaning in constrained circumstances, and the fundamental human instinct to maintain hope even when evidence for optimism seems scarce. The people of 1918 faced their invisible enemy with courage that was not extraordinary but simply human. And their success in rebuilding their world afterward demonstrates that recovery from collective trauma is not just possible, but inevitable. When communities commit to caring for each other through whatever challenges the future might bring, sleep peacefully, knowing that the human story continues, that each generation finds its own ways of facing unprecedented challenges, and that the quiet courage of ordinary people going about their daily business with care and consideration for others remains our most reliable resource for navigating whatever uncertainties tomorrow might hold. The voices from 1918 whisper across the century that survival is possible, recovery is certain, and the human capacity for adaptation and mutual care ensures that even the most challenging times eventually give way to seasons of healing and renewal.